Read the last section.
This act shall take effect immediately.
Clerk will record the vote. Mr. Pichardo to explain his vote.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for allowing me to explain my vote. I think the issue at hand is not allowing property developers and managers to reap some benefit from their properties. I personally don't have a problem with that, but I think what does happen, and I see this when I go door knocking in my district and I talk to my constituents and my neighbors about this particular issue, is that when we make an agreement with an individual, if it's a tenant to a landlord, and then a year later or 2 years later, that cost of the rent balloons, that completely throws at a tilt what a person's budget is. And then what some of my colleagues alluded to, it ups the amount of homelessness in the city. So what effectively is happening is that property developers, the bad ones, not the good ones, but the bad ones are fine with using our tax dollars to allow the city to pay for homeless shelters to house folks that they kick out so they can reap an immediate benefit. I don't think that's necessarily fair, and I think this bill does the right tact. I commend the sponsor of this legislation to make sure that this comes to this House, and in the interest of the tenants and the neighbors that I serve back in the West Bronx, I think this is a good way of creating more stable housing, not only in the Bronx, but across the city of New York. And in that being said, Mr. Speaker, I withdraw my request and will be voting in the affirmative on this bill.
Mr. Pichardo in the affirmative. Mr. Linares to explain his vote.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Every week, tenants approach my office with the issue of dramatic increase in rents after they have signed an initial lease, so-called preferential. They obviously have entered into an agreement, rent agreement, desperately looking for apartments as we have tens of thousands of families looking in areas like the one I represent. And lo and behold, they fall for the hook because obviously they're offered a much lower rent. Little do they know that at the end of that 2-year lease, if that is the case, there is an explosive rise in the rent that initially was offered to them. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of families that fall prey to this loophole that exists. So I believe that this is an effort to try to prevent another way of putting in the market units that otherwise would be regulated when they're desperately needed in the city of New York and in districts like mine. And this is why I am supporting this piece of legislation. Thank you.
Mr. Linares in the affirmative. Mr. Rivera.
Mr. Speaker, since I chose not to speak for 15 minutes because of time, I hope you bear with me and give me 2 minutes and 10 seconds. I want to commend the sponsor for putting together this bill. The sponsor is very well known in the housing complex that I live in, and that I pay $2,000 rent. And if the rent continues to increase, like most of you here, I'm a full-time worker. I don't have a part-time job. We haven't had a pay raise in 18 years. I'm not complaining. I can still afford to pay the $2,000. But if it keeps going to $3,000, like he sort of said, I'll be able to afford to move out of the state of New York. I'll come back once in a while and visit you guys and see how you're all doing. The fact of the matter is that this bill can contribute tremendously to making people be able to afford the rent they have. Let me say this, and I want to end it right here. We're trying very hard. Landlords have a right of a fair return for the investment. But we have a right. That's why we have a government that finally realizes that for people to be able to make ends meet, they need to make $15 an hour. And when we finally give workers $15 an hour, it's only $30,000 a year. Bill de Blasio has an affordable housing plan, which you got to make $31,000 a year in order for you to be able to pay the rent. It's not going to happen. That's why we need this bill. That's why this young man, he's so very well known in my housing complex, because a lot of the people that owns apartment or like me rent apartment, they're watching you in action right now. You got a lot to catch up on.
How do you vote, Mr. I gave you the
I
time.
vote in the affirmative. Thank you very much.
Mr. Rivera, in 2 minutes and 10, votes yes. Are there any other votes? Announce the results.
Ayes 79, noes 43.
The bill is passed.
Assembly 3682, calendar number 650, Mr. Wright, an act to amend the private housing finance law.
An explanation is requested, Mr. Wright. Members who are around Mr. Wright, would you please clear the way so that he can debate?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The purpose of this legislation is to institute a 4-year moratorium on the ability of rental Mitchell-Lama companies to dissolve in order to allow New York State Homes and Community Renewal to study the preservation, sustainability, reform, and the growth of the Mitchell-Lama housing program. You know, as of April of 2015, we have lost approximately 93 state-sponsored Mitchell-Lama developments, and that adds up to over 32,000 units of housing. So this is a housing stock that's very important to all of us around the state, number one, and it's housing stock that needs to be preserved, and certainly it's a housing stock that a lot of our fellow New Yorkers depend upon. So it has to be, we have to make sure that we preserve it, and that's our job right now. That's what this bill does.
Mr. Fitzpatrick,
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the sponsor yield?
will you yield, Mr. Wright?
Question.
Absolutely.
Mr. Wright yields.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Wright. Keith, we have a situation here where I think, calling for a moratorium and calling for, preventing the dissolution, we have a situation where we're changing the rules. We're moving the goalposts. We have an agreement in 20 years after the mortgage is paid, you're allowed to dissolve the Mitchell-Lama situation. A number of situations have developed where organizations like Community Development Corporation and others have joined together to provide assistance and opportunities for people to transition out of a Mitchell-Lama situation into another situation. What do you expect to accomplish? I mean, I would make the argument you're not losing any housing stock here. You still have those 30,000 units. You have the city right now under the current mayor is looking to build more affordable housing and is succeeding in that regard to provide for this. So the city benefits by having these units transition from Mitchell-Lama to market rate housing. That helps the rent rolls, which helps the tax situation in the city of New York. It realizes more tax revenue. What is your goal here to implement a moratorium for 4 years? What do you expect to change?
Well, since 1955, when approximate time that the Mitchell-Lama program was developed right here in this very chamber, and it was developed because we were going through a housing crisis then. And we are in, and those folks that have lived in Mitchell-Lamas, that have reared families, that have, put great roots in their neighborhood. My own mother lives in a Mitchell-Lama right now. And we're talking about communities that have been formed and very stable communities. So now fast forward from 1955 to present day. Now, present day, we are going through a housing crisis, the likes of which we have never, ever, ever seen before. Now, I know you were talking to Mr. Dinowitz before, but in New York City, we have a housing crisis of the proportions we've never seen. Now, the times demand that we look at how we can preserve our Mitchell-Lama housing because it was such a great program. It was a great program that was instituted right here in this very chamber. And I can imagine that you probably had the same types of debates back then. I don't know. I wasn't around. You may have been around, Mr. Fitzpatrick. I don't know. But anyway, but I can imagine that we are, I mean, right now we're going
Why do
through
you rise, Mr. Blake?
I was wondering if Mr. Fitzpatrick would yield for a few questions.
Sure, Michael.
Mr. Fitzpatrick yields.
Mr. Fitzpatrick, have you had the chance to review the recent audit that came from the comptroller of New York City as it relates to Mitchell Lama?
I have not seen it, no.
To Chairman Wright's points itself, have you also been able to have the opportunity to examine the recent housing crisis that's been happening specifically as it relates to Mitchell Lama residents?
Could you repeat that, Michael?
Have you been able to recently see the data about the crisis happening for Mitchell Lama residents on waiting lists?
I have not, but, you know, I've been around here a few years, Michael, and the crisis just seems to, you know, this is a crisis that never seems to go away. And we only read about this crisis in the city of New York or in New York State because we're the only state that has rent stabilization and rent control and rental regulation. So, you know, we always hear about the crisis. Each year it seems to get worse, yet it kind of goes counter to what Mayor de Blasio is trying to accomplish. There have been initiatives taken to allow Mitchell Lamas to get a higher rate of return, to stay in the program, also extending the tax breaks to keep them in the program. So I don't see the need for a moratorium here. The city is taking some aggressive efforts to encourage the development of affordable housing and continue affordable housing, but I don't see the need to change the rules at this point, Michael, to move those goalposts. If someone wants to take advantage of the incentives to stay in the program, they certainly can.
Thank you.
But to remove or change the rules, I don't think is helpful.
Thank you, Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Thank you.
Just as a point of reference, and then we'll yield the rest of my time. The recent question as it relates to the audit was raised, Mr. Fitzpatrick, because the audit indicated in that individuals were being jumped on current waiting lists that were supposed to be prepared for the next slots. And there were no rationale being given as to why those individuals were being jumped on those respective waiting lists. It actually led to recommendations and new legislation indicating that without that, individuals that were rightly on waiting lists prepared for next opportunities for Mitchell Lama apartments and co-ops, we're not going to have those opportunities. So as it relates to one of the reasons why that the chairman and others are mentioning this, it's necessary because the crisis has become even more relevant and critical.
Mr. Blake, you have asked Mr. Fitzpatrick to yield, so there is no time. It's
If
only
I may,
questions
if
that you can
it's
ask.
okay with the chairman,
Back
I'd like
to you,
to ask.
Mr. Fitzpatrick.
If it's okay with Chairman Wright, I'd like to ask Mr. Blake a question. Just, is that okay with you, Mr. Wright?
Mr. So you are asking Mr. Blake to yield.
Yeah,
Mr. Blake, will you yield?
Well, you know, maybe we'll do it at another time. How about after I know I just wanted the problem of jumping ahead of people. How is that relevant to a moratorium? Is that a problem that can be fixed outside the scope of a moratorium?
It cannot. Part of the reason why the chair and myself, as the chair of the Mitchell Lama subcommittee, most recently did a hearing, was recognizing that without such a moratorium, that entities who are the owners were able to dissolve out of the membership. It was actually leading to new management making determinations that they could facilitate in getting out of the Mitchell Lama without any communication happening to the residents. So without this moratorium being presented as such from the chair and others, what we saw from the audit was not just around the waiting list, it was also around the confusion around management that was happening respectively within those units. And therefore, the two critical requests that were happening were, number one, changes to how the waiting lists were being conducted, and secondly, a more manageable way to make sure that you were not facilitating buildings going into new management so that those that were actually residing there weren't actually having the protections there.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Blake. I would, but are these problems that require 4 years to resolve? Can they not be done in a matter of weeks or months? Do they not? Why would they need 4 years to resolve themselves? That's just a rhetorical question. You don't have to answer it, but I know Mr. Wright is on a tight schedule, and we want to,
Absolutely.
but maybe afterward we can
Thank
talk
you.
about it. Thank you. All right. On the bill, Mr. Speaker.
On
this-
the bill, Mr. Fitzpatrick.
You know, every year we discuss this. I understand the concerns raised by my colleague, the chair of the subcommittee. Certainly problems arise, problems can be addressed. I don't believe a moratorium is necessary to solve these problems. And if you want a moratorium, 4 years is certainly, I believe, excessive. Certainly a matter of weeks or months might be better if you want to deal with these issues. But the Mitchell-Lama project, or the Mitchell-Lama concept, does work. It's worked well. It has been modified over the years to encourage developers to stay in the program, encourage developers to participate in the program. But these developers get into the program understanding the rules. And that rule is that in 20 years upon paying off the mortgage, you are allowed to exit the program. The people who are the residents understand this. When you're in a Mitchell-Lama situation, and I think to change the rules and move the goalposts is not fair to them, and it will discourage investment in housing, and particularly in the Mitchell-Lama program. And for that reason, I would encourage a no vote. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Goodell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the bill.
On the bill, Mr. Goodell.
For many of us, the Mitchell-Lama program was started well before we were involved here, since it started back in 1955. You would be glad to know was not talking at that point in time, although I was moving. As part of the Mitchell-Lama program, developers were given low-interest loans by the state or by the city of New York. They were given tax exemptions or tax breaks, and in return, they agreed to rent to low to moderate income individuals. They agreed to rental restrictions, and they agreed to a limitation on their rate of return. So it was fundamentally a contractual agreement between the developers and the state and the city of New York. And their obligation, the developer's obligation, was limited to initially 30 years, then a 20-year period. The Court of Appeals has ruled that when individuals, private individuals, invest money in return for benefits in accordance with designated guidelines, it is to be treated as a contract. The developers couldn't pull out after 19 years and say, well, we've changed our mind, or pull out after 16 years and say we changed our mind. They were committed to the 20-year period. And likewise, the state cannot extend the time period an additional 4 years without us, the state, breaching our commitment to the developers. And because that commitment is considered a contractual relationship, trying to change that contractual relationship in the middle of the contractual relationship would violate the federal constitutional provision, which prevents the legislature from changing contracts. If our purpose is to force developers to rent at a lower price by being in the Mitchell-Lama program longer than they agreed to be in it, what we are doing, of course, is taking money out of their pockets so that others can get a price break. And while we can certainly, as a state legislature, approve programs to give housing subsidies and housing support, that is certainly within our authority using our tax dollars. When we try to accomplish the same objective by taking the money out of a private sector developer's pocket, it constitutes an unconstitutional taking of property. And the leading case on that is, again, a Court of Appeals case, Seawall Associates versus City of New York, if any of you would like to look it up. because of my concerns that we are trying to change the contractual relationship that we have with developers in the middle of that contract without providing compensation in violation of two separate constitutional provisions, I would recommend we vote against this provision. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Goodell. Read the last section.
This act shall take effect immediately.
Clerk will record the vote. Mr. Barron to explain his vote.
Mr. Speaker, I just wanted to thank Assembly Member for sponsoring this bill. In my beloved East New York, there's one of the largest housing developments in the nation called Starrett City, which is now Spring Creek. And we had to fight fiercely to stop a developer from purchasing Starrett City for $2 billion and moving out the people of Starrett City and raising it to market level rents. But because I had a great predecessor in this body here named Inez Barron, she was able to come before you and bring forth legislation that had Starrett City stay in the Mitchell-Lama program for the next 33 years, and also said that if any capital money came in capital investment, it couldn't just go to shareholders, but it had to be invested in the development. So I want to thank Assemblyman Wright for this bill, and I vote aye on this bill.
Mr. Barron in the affirmative. Ms. Robinson.
Very much. Mr. Speaker, may I be excused to explain my vote? I, too, would like to commend the sponsor on this piece of legislation because I remember the whole discussion that we had here regarding Starrett City at that particular time and how many people were bidding for that piece of property. And one of the things I'd just like to say is that we have established communities. When Mitchell-Lama was established, families went in, and families are still in these developments. So what happens when we abolish or those that are currently the owners of the property, they tend to vest out. If they vest out, where do these people go? And this is the same discussion that we had previously in regards to where do the families go, which has been discussed in terms of that much homelessness would exist because the people that went in, they went in at one level in terms of income, and some of them perhaps are still at that same income because they're on fixed income. So I vote in the affirmative on this bill and thank the sponsor for moving this forward.
Ms. Robinson, the affirmative. Mr. Buckwall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this bill. I've seen too frequently over the years situations where owners of Mitchell-Lama buildings use the threat of coming out of Mitchell-Lama status of buying out against their tenants. And that is something that I think, were it not for the fact that I'd seen that play out on the ground, I wouldn't necessarily think a moratorium is appropriate. But we need to send a message that this cannot be a constant threat against tenants who live in Mitchell-Lama buildings, that they will be brought out from state oversight on the whim of an owner. That's something that is not right for those tenants, but it's also not right for New York State. So, Mr. Speaker, I vote in the affirmative.
Mr. Buckwall in the affirmative. Mr. Linares.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to commend the sponsor of this piece of legislation. I believe that the Mitchell-Lama program is perhaps the flagship when it comes to the federal investment to address the need of housing, particularly for low-income and moderate-income families. And to see such an investment and successful initiative now turn the corner to be handed to the private sector, I think points to the neglect that we have seen at the federal level. And this is happening wholesale I believe that when we invest in programs like Michelama, we're looking at multiple generations that can benefit from such a program. When we turn it to the private sector, we sentence such investment and shortchange it at the detriment of families that have lived there for a long time, often enough have retired or have fixed income, and there goes the investment we did with our public monies. So I say we need to take a different look at this program and see how we can salvage it, particularly when we face such a dire need for housing, for working people, for low and moderate income families, and that's why I'm supporting this piece of legislation. Thank you.
Mr. Linares in the affirmative. Ms. Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is a pleasure to explain my vote on this very important matter. I happen to have the luxury of representing the District of Lama of the Mitchell-Lama initiative. And unfortunately, we've experienced in Brooklyn, in my district, a 716-unit Mitchell-Lama development come out of its Mitchell-Lama protections. And rents within that apartment complex, which is known as Atlantic Plaza Towers, have gone from $600 and $700 to $1,400 up to $2,000 virtually overnight. Unfortunately, that was a city HPD Mitchell-Lama development, and we weren't able to provide the protections in order to save that development and to save those tenants for those massive increases in hikes in rent. But I'm glad today that we can do all that we can do on the state level to make sure that low and moderate income tenants are protected, not just now, but for years to come. I proudly vote in the affirmative.
Ms. Walker in the affirmative. Ms. Richardson.
Thank you. I rise today in support of this piece of legislation. I currently reside in a Mitchell-Lama building. And the truth is that my building is predominantly full of seniors. That is Crown Gardens within Crown Heights, Brooklyn. We have several Mitchell-Lamas throughout the district. If the building was supposed to move out of the Mitchell-Lama status, I can't tell you the shock it would be to the rise of the homeless numbers in the city of New York, where we are already struggling. I'm in favor of creating more Mitchell-Lama. I think Mitchell and Lama had it right when they first developed this program. We have a responsibility to the people in the state of New York. So I want to commend the sponsor, Mr. Wright. I also want to commend the subcommittee of Mitchell-Lama Chair, Mr. Blake, on this piece of legislation. And with that, I vote in the affirmative.
Ms. Richardson in the affirmative. Are there any other votes? Announce the results.
Ayes 79, noes 39.
The bill is passed.
Assembly 3957A, Rules Report 123. Mr. Wright, an act to amend the Administrative Code of the City of New York.
An explanation is requested. Mr. Wright.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The purpose of this legislation is to require owners of rent-stabilized buildings in the city of New York that apply for major capital improvements, otherwise known as MCIs, rent adjustment, to first apply to receive tax abatement benefits pursuant to the J51 program. The owner may still receive the MCI benefits if their application for J51 was not denied due to untimely or improper completion of the application. So what this legislation does is just, it asks that it wants the owners to apply for J51 benefits in addition to the MCI.
Mr. Fitzpatrick.
You just yield for a
Will
question.
you yield, Mr. Wright?
Yes.
Mr. Wright yields.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Wright. what we're doing here, Keith, is we are mandating that an owner participate in a program that has the result of reducing the rent increase that they are entitled to. We talk about bait and switch. This is, this reminds me of let me make you an offer you can't refuse. It's not fair. It's not right. How do you justify forcing a private property owner into a government program that reduces the increase that a major capital improvement entitles them to?
Well, we're not trying to take away the MCI benefit or the program. Listen, we're just asking that the owner apply for J51 as a part of the MCI so that we can ease the burden of that MCI that is placed on the tenants that have to pay for the MCI. Listen, the MCI program, certainly, we have to look at, and I believe there's a bill that's coming up on the floor later on, how tenants pay for MCIs in perpetuity rather than for the life of the repairs that in fact need to be made. So we're just asking that the owners, while they're applying for the MCIs, apply for J51 also, so it'll ease the burden on the tenants.
Thank you, Mr. Wright. Mr.
Thank you.
Speaker, on the bill.
On the bill, Mr. Fitzpatrick.
I fully understand where the sponsor wants to go here, but the property owner is already limited in how much rent they can get. They're also dealing with increasing costs, water charges, sewer charges, the cost of maintaining housing stock. Much of this housing stock predates World War II. So getting an MCI to be able to increase that rent to a reasonable level, according to the Rent Guidelines Board, and I believe this past year there was a zero rent increase granted by the Rent Guidelines Board, even though costs continue to rise. So by compelling a private property owner to participate in or file for a government program that is going to limit their ability to recover their costs is unfair, it's unreasonable, and it's another example of moving the goalposts and changing the rules in the middle of the game. Respectfully request that we take a good hard look at this and vote no. Thank you.
Read the last section.
This act shall take effect immediately.
Clerk will record the vote.